Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. This is Brother Mushtaq with the Happy Strong Family weekly live stream. And this time round, we are going to be focusing on food. We've all heard of the tagline of the saying, "You are what you eat." We are going to deconstruct that, look at some of the myths, look at some of the facts. And with that, we have Dr. Zaihan Rashid on my right. How are you, Doctor?
Jazakallah khair. Very good, Brother Mushtaq. Always a pleasure to be here. I think when we did the wellness or the lifestyle matters webinar in early, I think it was August.
Yeah.
I mentioned that food has been far for too long taken as if it's something that's eaten because it feels good. It's tasty. It's why my mom always cooked. It's easily available.
It's comfort food.
And you know what? It makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to let our audience and myself today just have a little deeper look at this, because there are now people who are saying one of the main reasons why chronic disease is affecting our world is because of food choices.
Okay.
Not lack of food, the excess of food.
Oh.
So, just to introduce the topic and to make our Muslim audience in particularly aware of this serious issue, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, through an ayah of the Quran, given us a heads up on this.
Okay.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Allah ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kulu washrabu halalan tayyiba. O you who believe, eat and drink halal, which we are all familiar with, we
Mhm.
are allowed. But the other serious component called tayyib, which is something that is good for you, something that is beneficial to you,
Okay.
something that brings a long-term wellness to you. So the concept of pure is not just something that's clean, it's something that's beneficial. So take an example. Halal could be sugar, of course.
Mhm.
But if you have diabetes, sugar is not tayyib anymore.
Right. Right.
Similarly, if you have high blood pressure, salt normally would be halal.
Mhm.
But when you have high blood pressure, may Allah protect all of us and those who are watching, I mean, now salt is not tayyib anymore.
Right.
And these are just two very glaring examples.
Right. Right.
And then the other component of this ayah, just to complete, is وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Do not follow the footsteps of shaitan. It seems very interesting, Brother Mushtaq, that the concept of food and drink should be related in that manner to our declared forever enemy, shaitan.
Mhm.
I found that concept very interesting.
So how does that work? Again, we look at the context of the Quran.
For sure.
A very interesting point, and I have never thought of that. And I'm going to look at the camera. I don't think any of us have. But you have to understand the verses of the Quran were always brought down
Context.
with context
Absolutely.
and for a very specific reason, a
Absolutely.
reason that will be valid till the end of days, until the end of time. So what is that rationale? What is the reason that what is Allah, what is God trying to tell us
Remember that
in this verse?
First of all, I'm not a scholar.
Mhm.
I just want to make that clear. But because I have looked at this verse and its tafsir, its exegesis,
Yes.
I also know from your statement that never is something in isolation to be taken. This ayah, and we're not going to do a tafsir of this Quranic ayah
Mhm.
today,
Mhm.
but we're going to look at it to say, has food been mentioned in other parts of the Quran?
Okay.
Was food a part of the Prophet ﷺ's seerah? Was he better interested?
Mhm.
So when the Quran says, فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَىٰ طَعَامِ, which is Surah Abasa, immediately prior to that, Allah Ta'ala says, كَلَّا لَمَّا يَقْضِي مَا أَمَرَ. No, indeed, you have not done what we asked you.
Oh.
Serious,
Okay.
isn't it? Why would Allah Ta'ala precede the statement of فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَىٰ طَعَامِ, then let the human being look at his food?
Hmm.
Preceded by Kalla lamma yaqdi ma amara. No human being has not done, or you have not done what you were told. Which means food, therefore, even if we take away nothing from what I have said, we obviously look at it more deeply. One thing is clear, food is not something that Allah Ta'ala considers irrelevant. Because remembering that the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu
So,
wasalam, he said, a human being, the son of Adam, does not fill his stomach with anything less more harmful than food,
oh, okay. Yeah,
right?
for
And
sure.
that means excess food.
Right.
That doesn't mean to say that he should not eat at all. He's
Hmm.
saying, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, if he really has to eat, then he should eat a few morsels.
Right, right,
And
right.
the Prophet ﷺ acted on it. Now, all I'm saying here is portion control. The way I look at
For
it is,
sure.
he's informing us, look, food can harm you, be
Hmm.
careful. But of course, in other parts of the Quran, we read the description of food in ayahs where Allah is inviting us to come to Jannah's
Hmm.
delights, and food is a big part of it.
Right.
So, food is by no means condemned in any way. And so, just to go back to your first question, the exegesis of that statement of
Mhm.
Allah, says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kulu washrabu halalan tayyiba, I think it's the seriousness with which Allah Ta'ala classes food's importance in a Muslim's life. Because
Right.
he's saying, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. He's talking about those who have iman, those who have the desire to act on the information they have.
Yeah.
So, again, like I said, I didn't mean to turn this conversation into a Quranic exegesis, but I do believe from speaking to some of the scholars and looking at some of the tafasir, one of them is Tafhim al-Quran. Anybody who's interested can look at it. It's Maulana Maududi's translation and exegesis. The other one is Maulana Shafi Usmani, which is Maruf al-Quran. And there are others, the Noble Quran and others. You will find that this translation actually relates to the importance of food and its being pure and its being valid, obligatory.
Well, it makes things current, doesn't it? And again, if you take anything away from the Quran, and if you take away this much, that the Quran is that living, breathing code of conduct, if you will, for any and all Muslims, then that code of conduct comes down to some very current topics, which, you know, the nutritionists are even kind of enforcing today, as you said, portion control, the concept of clean eating, clean living. These are now being brought into the norm. It's being more normalized today. It's part of the culture. It's a TikTok hashtag somewhere, like how we were even addressing in the last episode. You know, hashtag my therapist, hashtag clean eating. So these things are being brought more into the cultural talk track. But this is nothing new for the Quran.
No.
So please, like, explain, because we want to talk up and carve out really two segments here: the consequences of poor eating habits on your health, and then food is mood.
Yeah. So, what I was hoping to do in this brief podcast was to, first of all, invite our audience to think of food as medicine.
Okay.
Food ought not to be taken as something we eat because we are hungry only.
Mm.
I think we look at the quantity, but then we more importantly look at the quality of food. Why is that relevant? I want to think of food in three contexts. There can be many, but just to make this conversation easy, one is food is, as I mentioned, alluded to right at the beginning, it's responsible for chronic disease if it's not taken care of. What do I mean? High blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and even, as you alluded to, related to neurological disease. We'll come to that in a minute. So, first, chronic disease that affects the communities where food choices are either poor or they are not taken care of.
Right.
Number two is remembering that in this COVID-19 related atmosphere, food has a lot to do with our immunity. But just to remind myself and all our audience, 60 to 70% of our immune system is sitting in our gut. This thing called gut associated lymphoid tissue, GALT for short, people can look it up if they want to. This is sitting in our gut. So that means there is a concept called the gut microbiome. I know it's a little technical, but remembering that our gut, our intestines, our tubes that digest food are full of literally billions and trillions of microbiota.
Okay.
Which means there are bacteria, there are viruses, and there are fungi. They're all friendly, most of them are friendly, but their health depends on what we eat. So if I put, for example, pizza, samosas, chapatis, rice, uh, cake, pasta, all these what I call short acting or what I call sugars that very quickly release into the body. Compare them then to an apple, for example.
Okay.
Compare then this to something like a complex carbohydrate. They
Right.
could be fruits, they could be vegetables, they could also be other types of, if you like, food components. But there's a difference between simple foods, which are basically deprived of nutrition, are simply energy based
Right.
and taste based, and others which are also tasty but which may not be so quickly eaten. So,
Hmm.
just to bring that concept of why gut related lymphoid tissue is important, is because our digestion starts in the mouth. And imagine somebody drinking apple juice and somebody chewing apple. There's a
Okay.
huge difference
Right.
right there to begin with. Just not to make the audience become too overwhelmed with this information. When you chew food, you actually tell your stomach that something is about to come to you, and I am starting this process of chewing, salivating, mixing. Really, you become a mindful eater.
Okay.
So think carefully of sitting on a table of food where you are, first of all, starting with the remembrance of God.
Mhm.
Bismillah tawakkaltu ala Allah. You have washed your hands. I have started my food with my right hand. I am eating small portions.
Right.
I am looking at my food as a blessing, as
Mhm.
opposed to something I quickly have to get it over and done with while I'm checking my email or my Facebook.
Right.
This whole concept then changes the seriousness of what I'm doing.
For
The
sure.
third component of this podcast, I hope, can be really what you said earlier, the very important association of mood with food.
Yeah.
So, food and mood now are very well known concepts. So,
Mhm.
three concepts: one, chronic disease; two, association of immunity with food;
Right.
and three, the very well known understanding that a person's mood is affected, a person's mind state is affected by what they're
Right.
eating.
Right. So then, Doctor, let's block and tackle number one, and that would be chronic disease. And I think for a lot, within the community at large, it's usually something like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, within that kind of trifecta, if you will.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the good foods, some of those clean foods that someone could eat?
First of all, Brother Mushtaq, I want to emphasize upon a very simple concept:
Please.
things that are made in plants versus things that are grown on plants.
Interesting. Do tell.
So, for example, a cookie is made in a plant, an
Oh,
apple is grown on a plant,
okay.
a samosa is made in a factory,
Yeah.
but sweet potato or potato are grown in the plant,
Right.
on the plant, I should say.
Yeah.
So, if one just looks at things to say, now, this thing that I'm about to put in my stomach, how did it get to be where it is? And you will realize it's been heavily processed.
Mm.
So, just to take a typical dish that would be cooked, for example, we are cooking things at high temperature. And for example, I mean, if people are using oil, and most people are,
Sure.
not a problem. But when you boil this liquid at high temperature, you
Mm.
actually release some very unusual and some potentially very harmful some compounds, because at high temperature, olive oil doesn't remain that olive oil that you had bought from the store, which says extra virgin olive oil.
Good
No
point.
longer is that olive oil.
Good point.
Similarly, when me and you are roasting or barbecuing a chicken, we
Uh-huh.
have to remember that the outer layer of this chicken is now going to give that half burnt smell.
Mm.
But these are the hydrocarbons that are actually considered precarcinogenic. So these
Mm.
cannot just be ignored and saying it's tasty. Yes, it is. But as I alluded to right at the beginning, the idea that food should be tasty versus beneficial should be taken carefully. It should be tasty and beneficial.
Right.
Yes, I'm not saying by any means that we should take untasty food. And like when somebody said to me, I can't eat grass like you. And I said, I don't eat grass. Are you implying that fresh green vegetable is equivalent to grass?
Right.
Are
Right.
you really saying that? And of course, that person wasn't saying that, but I think you get the point.
Yeah.
People think taste is so important to me that I'm
Mm.
willing to ignore what it's going to do to my inside. And I'm saying, no, uh, chronic disease is affecting our world to the extent. We all saw what happened to our health system just a few months ago when COVID was simply overdoing to everything to the point that things are about to collapse.
Right. Right.
Why did it get to that stage? Because chronic disease burden is already so high.
Yeah.
So people who don't like going to the doctor, people who don't particularly think that it's a good idea to get yourself, let's say, annual checkup, etc.,
Uh-huh.
then they have to take that care to say chronic disease. Let's take diabetes, for example.
Mhm.
Diabetes type 2. which is the one that usually comes on in later years,
Hmm.
is singularly because of the inability of this hormone called insulin, which is a sugar distributing hormone that we
Hmm.
release. By the way, every time we eat something, we release insulin.
Got it.
This insulin is generally a helpful hormone because it allows sugar to go where it belongs, where
Hmm.
it's usually in the blood, used up for whatever we're doing. But if we are eating constantly, which means if we are not taking breaks between food, we are promoting the chronic release of insulin. Chronic release of insulin, which sadly is one of the reasons why diabetes develops, occurs because people are starting to eat so frequently now.
Got it.
There is some research that's showing that there are 21 food contacts by the average American on a daily basis, which is obviously not good news. The idea of intermittent fasting, for example, that has
Yeah.
very recently taken hold, is just because the gut needs rest.
Hmm.
And so when people become overwhelmed with food because it's really comfort more than benefit,
Right.
people start to eat in their cars. People
Hmm.
start to munch when they're stressed.
Yeah.
People eat when they should not be eating, like late in the evening, for example.
Right.
So
Right.
chronic disease is not one single horse that everything can be piled on. But if I can point to three things: one, eat more foods that are going to require mindfulness. And that means food that's not soft, food that is in its original state.
Yeah.
And I gave an example of an apple. It could be a pear, it could be a banana, it could be a honeydew, it could be melon, etc. It
Sure.
could be some fresh vegetables also.
Yeah.
Once you take that concept on board, you'll immediately see that your plate will be more likely to have been laden with what's called food that came off the plants, not from the plants. I hope I
Right.
can make that distinction.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Number two is remembering that food should be chewed well.
Hmm.
This idea that food is soft and easily eaten sadly also gives rise to a lot of food that's eaten without being chewed. And as I alluded to earlier, digestion starts in the mouth. My mother famously used to say, stomach doesn't have teeth. We have to remember that.
Right.
That still remains true.
Yep.
And number three, remembering that food should be taken as a blessing, should be taken as something that is beneficial because it has got so much taste, for example.
Hmm.
The average nutritionist is saying we should be chewing a particle of food 20 to 30 times, which in all honesty most of us are not doing.
No. How
So
many of
these
us
three
do that?
concepts to avoid chronic disease: first, foods that are coming from the plants, meaning natural plants, not manufactured in plants.
Yeah.
Number two, foods that require chewing.
Hmm.
Number three, recognizing that food is a blessing.
Right.
So that when we sit in company, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, food when it's eaten in company brings blessing. Actually, there's a Sahabi who said he could not fill easily, words to that effect.
Hmm.
And the Prophet ﷺ said, do you eat alone or do you eat in company?
Right.
So it means company also is a big, if you like, maybe it's maybe it's something that actually makes a person not eat too much because others are watching.
Hmm.
But I think it's a blessing of food that really comes in.
For sure, because I think once you're in that that social
Yeah.
kind of gathering setting, maybe you take on the persona of being a host, and as the host, you're kind of more inclined to make sure the others get their
Yeah.
fill. Something to that effect.
Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, producer Kasha. All right, so let's continue then, Dr. Rashid. What can we do to now block and tackle number 2 of the points that you wanted to raise?
So the point number 2 that I meant was recognizing immunity.
Okay.
Our immunities, by the way, are not just resting on somebody giving us a shot, which I think has been increasingly taken on, because I've heard from people, if you've taken a shot, taken vaccination, you are now safe from the possible effect of that disease in the future.
A vaccine.
A vaccine. I
Yeah.
politely disagree.
Okay.
I would say immunity is a whole concept. What that means is food, of course, is a big part of it.
Mhm.
Because remembering foods, for example, and this is why I'm very, if you like, addicted to fruits in particular,
Uh-huh.
is because fruits, if you took a whole volley of them, you'll start to realize they actually have things called antioxidants, for example. They also have things such as lycopenes, for example.
Mhm.
So there are 3 things that foods do for immunity. Number 1 is acute immunity, which means the protection against, you'll see people who get frequent colds, for example, people who get constipated, for example, people who, for example, will find themselves affected by tiredness,
Mm-hmm.
by this chronic fatigue, by
Mm-hmm.
this fogginess, by this bad mood, even.
Right.
All of these things I politely suggest that people are coming because your digestive system has been taken literally a hostage.
Okay.
Please take back your digestive system. Some of the things I alluded to already. And when I say plants, I don't mean just plants. I mean you can eat meat, no
Mm-hmm.
problem.
Mm-hmm.
But recognize that meat industry, and I don't want to obviously tip on anybody's toes, but industrially produced meat has consequences. Food that has been made to be produced in large amounts. Some of the things that the people who were on the nutritionist side of the argument of why immunity was affected in COVID
Right.
were saying that food is being moved massive distances, right? So cattle are being literally transported across the country to
Mm-hmm.
go from A to B.
Yeah.
Cattle that are enclosed in somehow very unhygienic and very uncomfortable conditions. Not
Mm.
only that, there is other things being done to them to make sure they are big
Yeah.
and they very quickly are able to provide that juicy steak that I'm looking for.
Right.
I
Right.
would
Right.
say that people who want their immunity to be protected ought to be more careful with what they're putting in their mouth.
Good point.
Particularly when it comes to meat, recognize that there has been a huge effect on this industrial production of meat by giving the animals hormones, for example,
Yeah, that's what we all hear about.
by giving the animals antibiotics, because remember,
Right. Right.
hormones weaken their immunity.
Mm.
Similarly, the grain that's been given to them has also been affected by GMOs, right? The
Genetically
genetically
modified.
modified. So we can't ignore all these things when we
Mm.
come to our food because our health is not some single entity.
Right.
Of course, it's going to be affected by my sleep hygiene, which we're going to take on another podcast. Of course, it's going to be affected by the physical activities they do,
Mm-hmm.
because there are things that are actually produced in response to physical activity. And one of the factors that is called brain derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF.
Okay.
This factor is produced by physical activity. This factor helps us think clearly. And I'm going to allude to that in the third part of this question.
Okay.
But just for immunity's sake, if we are careful about what we are putting in our stomach, if
Mm.
we are careful with the place where we got this food from, one of the very a friendly farmer that I used to know in Saskatchewan before I came to Ontario, I remember used to say, I really value the fact that Muslims want to do halal qurbani. They
Mm.
want to slaughter their animals so that the blood is shed. But this process only takes 1 minute. He said, very few Muslims have actually asked me, what was this animal doing for the 1 year before it got to where it is?
Oh.
Because surely what it ate, surely the company it kept, surely the environment in it which was placed must have affected it as well. So
Right.
if we don't look at the carefulness of where that halal meat that we brought from the local store, but
Mm.
is it tayyib? Do I know its source? Do I know what was done to that animal?
Right.
Do I know, for example, if it was slaughtered under humane? I mean, sadly, there is very little emphasis on these things. And my point, Brother Mushtaq, in saying all this is this matter of hormones in the animal's body
Mm.
are not just hormones that were injected, hormones that were released at the time of its death. So if
Right.
the animal was knocked on the head, it released massive amounts of corticosteroids and adrenaline.
Yeah.
And believe you me, those hormones are very much in the body of that animal
Mm.
when me and you consume it.
Wow.
So when you hear all these strange phenomena occurring, and I'm not going to go into the detail because we're not talking about strange phenomenon in this podcast, but when I hear people becoming sick so easily and so prolonged periods of time,
Mm.
I have very little doubt in my mind that immunity is not one of our concerns. So somehow we think we can take a pill when we become sick. Somehow we can just take a few days off, or we are but we don't think about why is it that we are finding ourselves sick. Uh, Another thing that I want to point out here is I'm sure have heard an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
For sure.
Because of the depletion of nutrients in the soil, now that has become 6 apples a day.
Oh no.
We no longer can accept that it's okay to just eat one apple and do whatever we like with the rest of our
So then, Dr. Rashid, again, I'm going to put it in some basic terms. When from wherever you may be, I'll just use a very specific example close to home. For myself, if I'm over the weekend, at a family dinner or at a gathering. There's a delicious plate of biryani in front of me, whether it's chicken, veal, beef, or lamb. Biryani's biryani. I have never, and I'll be very candid, I've never given much thought to how was this meat, dealt with. What was the state of the animal when it was slaughtered? As you say, maybe it was knocked on the head, or maybe it was just in a state of fear. Obviously, animals are animals, but then you have to look at how that animal was taken to slaughter. Is it? And then there's a whole other side debate for another maybe discussion or not discussion with that machine cut versus hand slaughtered and all of that. That all being said, if I then kind of go to the route of, if it's not biryani, maybe it's like the good old fashioned, dessert that I'm then having as comfort food. What are some of the actual fruits and vegetables then that could very much boost our immunity? What are some practical examples?
For sure. And I expect that the people who are listening do want to.
Because we do have some questions from the audience, which
sure.
I want to get to as well.
Just to answer that question very briefly, people have to take their health more seriously.
Sure.
I can't emphasize enough that food is the biggest reason you will be going to the doctor. Whether it's acute food poisoning, which is not common in Canada, because food hygiene is really big. However, I'm talking about chronic disease.
Yeah.
I don't foresee us to, I think all of us have the idea that we want to live an average of 75 to 80 years. Well, I'm saying if you want to live quality lives, if you want to enjoy your grandson and your granddaughter, if you want to be here for the community when you are experienced and well-rounded, then you cannot present yourself in a manner where I am unable to get up. I mean, I noticed the increasing number of chairs in the masajid, which indicates that we have bad knees, we have poor backs, we are unable to stand.
Right.
We are depriving ourselves of Fajr Salah. I don't believe these things are happening by chance. I think these are indicating that we have a chronic energy crisis, excess energy, but poor nutrition. And I'm saying people ought to take this matter seriously. So just coming back to that issue of meat, I strongly believe, Brother Mushtaq, that it's high time that the community of Muslims that are so fond of meat take charge of where this meat is coming from. And that we all sit together and not ignore this to a few nutritionists who may or may not have any interest in it, but to make this a project, just like education is a project. I believe nutrition is a project too, because after all, we're looking at chronic disease. After all, we are looking at chronically unhappy people. After all, we're looking at an ummah that instead of leading people is following. So I hope that makes people think that there's no way I can address everything in this short podcast.
Sure.
But I'm hoping I'm making people think.
Definitely.
This is an important matter.
Right.
Please don't ignore this. Please don't think I'm well now. I often say to people, wellness does not mean to say the absence of disease. Don't misunderstand absence of disease as a way of identifying that you are healthy.
Right.
I hope, inshallah, nobody has this concern, but I strongly say to people, you have to look at what you're eating if you want to stay well into your 70s and 80s.
So now, Producer Kashif, let's get to some questions. I know you had kind of put on the screen, there are 3 of them. So
yes, Jazakallah khair. So the first question that came in from the audience was, living in North America, are there any vitamins you recommend to supplement a healthy diet to ensure we are not deficient in anything? And I guess as an example, they say, I am taking vitamin D, omega-3, and magnesium.
Jazakallah khair. A question that comes from a concerned member who's clearly up on nutrition. I would repeat what I said earlier. A wholesome, nutritious diet cannot be replaced by artificial substances. That being said, omega-3, which the audience member is indicating, omega-3 is something that is a specific fatty acid, combination of fatty acids, docosahexaenoic acid, linolenic acid, and others. So these acids are available, these omega-3s are available normally in deep sea salmon. We're not going to get that easily. So we will have to replace it with other components, and omega-3 therefore becomes a relevant part of it. So yes, omega-3 for people over 40, I recommend that they ought to check the source of this omega-3, make sure that it is a deep fish related omega-3, which means the omega-3 capsule, and I often say this to people, if you're very fond of your omega-3, make sure you open one of the capsules and make sure that it smells like fish. Because if it
Right.
doesn't, then it is not got what you think it has got.
Right.
So the source is extremely important. But the answer to that question is yes. Magnesium is probably one of the most depleted ions, unfortunately, in our community. Potassium is another one. Now, people don't think of potassium so much, but potassium is what I call the natural tranquilizer. People normally need, adult individuals, men and women, will need about 4,500 ions of potassium every day.
Oh,
So that's not a small number.
no.
But that can be achieved if you are having a rounded diet. So fruits will be a big source of potassium.
Like a banana.
Like a banana can be. So one banana will give you about 400 ions. So you'll have to eat 15 bananas before you get that required dose.
Oh, goodness.
So obviously
Okay.
that's not going to be practical.
Yeah.
But you also have other sources, many other sources. So meat is another source, for example. Then you have fresh vegetables, for example. I didn't name specific fruits, but fruits of the season generally would be so oranges, for example,
Okay.
apples, for example,
Okay.
pumpkin, subhanallah. People throw them out. I saw them literally abandoned in the tons the day after Halloween, which is a pure tragedy because pumpkin has got some of the best anti-hypertensive natural ingredients there is in any vegetable at all.
Antihypertensive meaning,
Meaning people who suffer from high blood pressure.
high blood pressure. Okay.
Pumpkin pie is an extremely beneficial thing for them.
Oh.
Similarly, there are things that people suffer from depression. We could go into that detail, of course. But the last question the brother is asking is vitamin D.
Yeah.
Yes, vitamin D is something that one ought to take. I highly recommend that people have an analysis of their vitamin D and magnesium levels before they start taking them in a specific amount. Because remembering, without knowing your levels, you'd be guessing. You could take what is called a daily allowance, but what if you're deficient to begin with? So the answer to that question is yes, you need all three, but make sure that we have assessed the magnesium and vitamin D level in your body by having your family doctor write a
Okay.
prescription.
Okay. Producer Kashif, question number 2, please.
Yes. Question number 2 is, for immigrants from South Asian countries, does the food they are accustomed to need to change due to climate or quality foods? I guess in Canada they're talking about now, or North America, or if they are healthy eating what they ate back home.
Jazakallah khair. Again, a question that's relevant. I think what I would do here is go back to my initial suggestion. Look at the amount of change you are doing to the food. So it means if you are boiling things at high temperature, consider that you are probably depriving yourself of the most nutritious aspects of the food.
Okay.
Because most of the vitamins and, if you like, the trace elements will not survive high temperatures. Taste will remain. Definitely the texture will probably be there. And even the smell will be there. But I'm saying let's also pay attention to the nutritious aspect of it, which means highly changed foods from their original will generally not have much nutrition left in them, although energy will be there, caloric values will be there, but you may not have all the other additional factors that I'm suggesting.
And like you were saying earlier, likewise, when you fry something in oil, then it changes the food as well.
Yes, it does. Not only that, but my concern is that the oil actually changes into hydroxycarbons and some other not so, if you like, beneficial things. Particularly is this true when you're barbecuing, when you're you're basically burning, as I call it, that meat to get that taste. But I'm saying we owe it to ourselves to recognize that we may be producing more harm than good. When we lather on things with, for example, sauces, these sauces are full of refined sugar. They're full of fructose-based sugars. Fructose-based sugars are one of the biggest reasons the epidemic of diabetes and the epidemic of obesity is affecting our countries. So we cannot ignore these facts. But the answer to that question is you can continue to eat what you're eating,
right,
as long as there is a healthy input in your diet of fresh foods, particularly fresh fruits and fresh vegetables.
Okay. Producer Kash, let's get to question number 3, please.
So the third question is actually I'm going to ask on myself, as you know, I always throw some questions.
As you usually do, yeah.
Yep. And I know Dr. Rashid, we've done a lot of parenting workshops and parenting classes with him. That's how I actually got introduced to Dr. Rashid. So I sort of want to tie it back to parenting.
For sure.
So, you know, I myself have a toddler, like a 4-year-old. That's very hard to get him to eat and stuff. But when I'm doing reading, one of the things I think we're doing a disservice to our children is we're forcing them to eat everything on the plate and telling them that, hey, there's starving children all over the world. You have to finish.
Mhm.
You have to finish what I decided is good for you, or what
Right.
a restaurant decided is good for you. So when talking about that mind-body connection, how do we sort of teach that to their children? Because by forcing them to finish their plates, clean their plates, every last
Mhm.
drop, I think that's creating some bad habits of overeating and overindulging
Good point.
when the body has sort of, their bodies have told them, I've had enough, right? But then you got to balance that with kids being kids and not wanting to eat and play, right? They're
Right. Great
so,
question.
yeah.
Great question. Great question.
Jazakallah khair. So children, like adults, very much take into the environment. They are very much going to be a part of what they see as normal.
Okay.
They like copying. Children are huge mimickers. Children also are very fresh from God. So they act very much on their fitra. So I completely agree with the idea that people ought not to force food down children's throats.
Mhm.
They ought to be allowed to choose within a healthy choice. So I don't offer them, for example, a donut and a pizza and apple. They're not going to take the apple if you're giving them that choice.
For sure.
We put fresh things, we allow them choices, and we encourage them, but we don't force them.
Right.
And like I said, food is not something that in isolation can be taken as eat it or else.
Mhm.
Body language, facial expression, happiness conveyed when we are eating, the joy of being sitting together, a routine, a child who sees food as a blessing, a child who has seen his mum or dad take an interest in food, just like food ought to be taken an interest in. It's
Mm.
a valuable blessing.
Right.
We talk about it. We say Bismillah. We thank Allah, Alhamdulillah. We don't do things, for example, as Brother Kashif quite rightly said, to put food on a plate and force a child to eat would, I think, be genuinely a way to produce some very acute, unpleasant memories in the child's mind in the long term.
Right.
At the same time, to offer children unhealthy foods, particularly sugary foods,
Mm.
particularly distracting children, as I've seen people do, where there is a movie or some cartoon playing on a cell phone
Yeah.
and a child is being stuffed with food. That's mindless eating.
Mm.
That is creating an atmosphere which indicates food is not really important as long as this cartoon entertains you. We can just stuff your food. So I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm angry. I'm not angry. I'm just genuinely concerned that mothers and fathers don't realize that food really ought to be something that a child loves,
Right.
particularly healthy food.
Got it.
Food that has come from loving hands and
Mhm.
loving faces and has been given an environment where the child feels. But at the same time, we've just got to be careful that the child doesn't become so picky that we're just busy feeding it no matter what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a fine line. You have to balance it.
So now, Dr. Zaihan, we have a few minutes remaining in the
Yeah.
podcast. We usually keep them around the 45 or
Yeah.
50-minute mark. So let's use the remaining portion of the podcast, of this live stream, to talk up food and well-being, food and mental health, food and mood.
Jazakallah khair. So once again, the concept of mood and the
Mhm.
concept of the mind being closely linked to the gut
Right.
has come from what's called the gut-brain connection.
Okay.
The gut-brain connection defines the fact that certain foods, particularly foods that have fibrous coverings, this would include fruit in a big way.
Okay.
This would include fresh vegetables in a big way.
Uh-huh.
This will even include the organically prepared bread in a good way.
Okay.
What that does is it gives the intestine some kind of, if you like, husk or covering that allows these bacteria, which for many of us, bacteria is an unhealthy thing, but there are friendly bacteria. As I often say to
Okay.
people, there's friendly fire also, and there's unfriendly fire. This is actually friendly. So the majority of these bacteria survive on what me and you are eating.
Uh-huh.
So if we want this microbiome, as I mentioned earlier, to be healthy, we have to give it food that allows this gut bacteria to feed and then release peptides, PEPTIDES, which funnily enough travel to the brain by what's called the vagus nerve.
Okay.
The vagus, VAGUS. Those of your audience that are medically inclined, you can look it up. These peptides actually are genuinely responsible for some of our happy hormones in the brain.
Right.
So hormone, I'm sure you have heard that we have things, medications in particular, which increase certain, if you like, transmitters. So
Mhm.
serotonin is one of them.
All right.
Dopamine is another one of
For
them.
sure.
and there are others like oxytocin, etc.
Mhm.
These hormones are actually responsible for what are called pleasure center transmission. So when we, for example, see food that we like, these hormones are released in the brain.
Mhm.
And not to become too complicated, but there are centers in the brain that are specifically called food centers,
Okay.
hunger centers, and satiety centers, which means when I'm full, these centers are going to indicate that I'm full.
Right.
These centers are also affected by these hormones, by these enzymes that are being released.
Mhm.
So the state of unhappiness for a lot of people is resulting because foods are being eaten that are depleted of any of the fiber that would have provided this background of happy hormones. Also, the element of a person that does not pay attention to the not just the nutrition aspect, but the what's called the finer components of the food. So there are, for example, trace elements, right?
Okay.
So potassium, as I indicated earlier, is actually considered to be a physiological tranquilizer, which
Mhm.
means something which, if it's present in its appropriate amount, will allow neurotransmission to take place. So our body is an electrical machine.
Okay.
Our
Okay.
body, and those of us who are familiar with an EKG, for example,
Yeah.
if you've seen a heart tracing, you know that the body is being recorded, the heart is being recorded with an EKG. And similar thing happens with the brain. There's something called an EEG, electroencephalogram. So the
Mhm.
body is an electrical system.
Yeah.
So imagine if we are close to cell phones, we are
Mhm.
close to computers, we are close to televisions, we are
Mhm.
close to microwaves, we are sitting in a car. These are all electrically charged devices.
Right.
Our body is collecting charge all day.
Mhm. Mhm.
If we don't discharge this somehow, and one of the excellent ways of doing this is to do sajda. When you put your head down, when we do, as those of us who put our head down, we actually discharge all this excess charge. When food is present that allows the same charge to be absorbed, charge to be removed, the same activity occurs inside us. So mood is directly linked to some of these things, not all of them, that will actually add to the quality of our, if you like, anxiety, for example. So there's some foods that are anxiety producing.
Oh.
They're all fast foods, unfortunately.
Okay.
So
Okay.
people who eat, I'll tell you why this is, just to make it short.
Please.
When sugar is released in a big way into the body,
Mhm.
which it always is if we eat these fast food. The reason they're called fast foods is because they're very fast in releasing their sugar.
Got it.
So when sugar is released in this big amount, this hormone that I alluded to earlier called insulin comes in.
Mhm.
Chronic insulin excess produces a state of anxiety
Right.
because it also brings out the other two big hormones, which are called the flight and fight hormones, which you may have heard of,
Yeah.
called the catecholamines,
Okay.
which are the adrenaline and the noradrenaline. I'm sorry, I'm very technical, but I think it's good to know. These hormones will normally come out when you are scared,
Yeah.
or when you are anxious,
Right.
or when you are frightened,
Right.
scared, frightened, or when you are simply too anxious. Something
Mhm.
happened that you don't like. Something like a tough question is put to you, or you're expected to do something that you can't do, that kind of thing. So these foods sadly have the same anxiety provoking effect on people. And then on the other side are foods that calm people down. And a lot of those foods will be the ones where sugar is released very slowly in the body.
What would
So
be a fruit?
chewing an apple,
Okay.
right?
Fruits again.
Fruits, big time.
And vegetables.
And vegetables again. There'll be other things too, but I'm suggesting to the audience not to make it too complex. Find in your array of foods that are colored. I'll give you an example. Raspberry is colored,
Mhm.
apple is colored,
Okay.
orange is colored,
Yeah.
grapes are colored.
Okay.
Take an eggplant, colored. Take a courgette or a
Cucumber.
cucumber, colored. So bring in an array of colors into your diet.
Mm.
Your food platter should look like an array of beautiful colors: yellow, orange, blue, blueberries,
Blueberries. Got it.
strawberries,
Right.
cranberries.
Yeah.
Bring in all these things, and you'll find that you actually have an amazing amount of what are almost called, again, I don't want to specify because there are so many little components. They're called isothiocyanines, there are lycopenes, there are antioxidants.
Yeah.
All these, I'm sorry, I
No,
don't
this
want
is
to
all
sound very
good. This is all
technical,
good. All
but
good.
I'm saying if people look up and see how many of these actually, literally, they are responsible for the good transmission of nerve signals across our nerves.
Got it.
How they actually release a lot of harmful energy literally out of the brain.
So now, Dr. Rashid, we have, I think, one more question
sure.
from producer Kashif. Let's get to that.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. So, yeah, I know we're at the upper limit. So after this question, inshallah, we'll have to wrap up.
For sure.
But it's an important question. And, Dr. Rashid was talking about doing sajda. So I think it's a good segue into that question. Where is it here? Importance of water and how much to drink. Drinking too much makes it difficult to maintain wudu, especially at work.
Yeah, good point.
A good question. I did mean to bring in hydration as a part of the conversation. Jazakallah khair for the questionnaire. I think water drinking on average, we should remember that our bodies are 70% water. So the good part of it is fruit and vegetables largely are comprised of water.
Okay.
Processed food like donuts, like cheesecakes, like samosas, cookies, they are water deprived. So you actually replace a lot of water indirectly when you eat these vegetables and fruits that I've been alluding to. You can also, by all means, drink water, but please avoid sugary water, which is what soda is. These are actually anxiety-promoting enzymes.
Okay.
These are actually things that have contained things like aspartame. These are things that have got artificial sweeteners in them, which are actually very seriously implied in some other illnesses, including Alzheimer's and neurological diseases. So to answer that question, approximately 2 liters on an average adult on a daily basis.
Which would be how many glasses?
So you're talking
more
about
or less
maybe 4 to 6 glasses.
Okay.
But if you are eating, as I said earlier, watery fruits, like orange, for example, like watermelon, for example, like honeydew, for example, like grapes, etc., you already have 80 to 90% component of water coming from there also. So you can easily make this a part of your healthy diet. You say, I'm going to drink on average 4 glasses of water. Wudu, yes, that's true. The way I look at it, wudu is every time you make wudu, the Prophet ﷺ said, your minor sins are washed off.
Yeah.
I find that so beneficial that I think, although I understand where the question is coming from, but I would say if you make that an overall strategy, that I will eat more things that grow on plants, less things that come from plants, I think you've gotten a very good idea of what I've been trying to say for the last 40 minutes.
Fantastic. So now, Dr. Rashid, let's wrap up. And the whole mission, the whole purpose of this podcast is to do the unthinkable in terms of tackling those tough questions. When we say happy, strong family, we mean that in the context of how can you be a strong individual? How can you be a happy individual? And then the rest cascades out from there. Your friend circle, your family, and all of that. And you have brought to light some very important, issues surrounding what we eat. And ultimately, as the saying goes, we are what we eat, according to our gut health, according to our mood, and according overall to the longevity of who you want to be in this life. So, Dr. Zaihan, thank you so very much. Just continue with the questions. Producer Kashif looks after the questions on our YouTube channel, on our Instagram, and all our socials. So do keep those questions coming even after the fact. We'll address them in upcoming sessions, and this will give us fodder for those upcoming sessions, which we can then also block and tackle when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to mental well-being, mental health, and ultimately the health of you, our viewers. So we're gonna sign off for now. Thank you as always for tuning in every Sunday. Jazakallah khair, and thank you to all the audience.